following a very violent night. Sirens sounded again this morning in various communities along the Israel-Gaza border, including the city of Ashkelon, the biggest city on the Gaza border, a city that was spared rockets overnight but was targeted this morning. Sirens again, as we're saying, have sounded in the last hour and a half in the city of Ashkelon, and this follows a violent night on the border with no less than 150 rockets fired from the strip towards Israeli territory. At least 10 Israelis have been injured in various communities on the Gaza border. One woman is in serious condition, while the others, most of them from the city of Sderot, are in light to moderate condition. The Israeli Air Force retaliated with 3 waves of strikes on Hamas targets all across the Gaza Strip. The IDF says it has hit strategic installations belonging to the organization controlling the Gaza Strip, while Palestinian sources say at least 3 people have been killed due to those strikes. Israel's Home Front Command toughened its instructions to the residents of the Gaza border area, saying that no public events can take place in open areas, only in closed places with shelters, and no agricultural work is allowed in the lands adjacent to the border fence. We now cross live to the Israel-Gaza border to our correspondent Ariel Levin-Waldman. Ariel, thank you for being with us. You're there in the city of Sderot, one that took a direct hit last night. How do things look like there?
Look, it's taken several direct hits over the past few days, at least 6 in total, and people here say they are terrified. I spoke to one resident that said his daughter is crying in the night and his children are afraid to leave their home, and this has become a very common sight here in Sderot. I've mentioned some of the raw statistics. In Sderot, there's roughly a 50% rate of children with post-traumatic stress disorder, very similar number amongst adults, people who have lived through all the conflicts in this area, and hundreds of rockets every single week. And during periods of conflict, those numbers are often recorded even higher, as high as 70 or even 80% among certain populations. And residents are worried they are very swiftly returning to one of those times of conflict. In the past month, nearly every single week has seen rocket barrage after rocket barrage. This, of course, being one of the most intense since the war in 2014. The military and the Home Front commander out giving orders, no public events to be held, as you mentioned. And you could see some of their people and their positions along the street here as they give their orders and attempt to enforce this state of affairs. The military has already drawn up, but has not enforced, it's just a plan being floated, a new evacuation plan for all the settlements in the area and all the border communities to try to prevent any escalation or any threat to human life as the situation continues to degrade.
And Ariel, you're there in Sderot, and as you're speaking, we're hearing of actually more sirens sounding in some of the communities there, not far from the city of Sderot, where you are. Ariel Levin-Waldman joining us there from the city of Sderot on the Israel-Gaza border. Thank you very much for being with us. Here with me in the studio is defense analyst Martin Himmel and our diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim. Thank you both for being with us. Martin, we'll begin with you. Israel's sort of Israeli officials had this understanding that this might happen yesterday. Hours before this barrage came, we were already heard of road closures and instructions for civilians, as if Israel understood that this was going to be the reality overnight. Why so? Is it because of that incident on Tuesday when 2 Hamas operatives were killed?
Well, Hamas has established ground rules of low-level conflict. So if Israel strikes at Hamas soldiers, at Hamas militiamen, then Hamas will strike at Israeli targets. That's the rules of this low-level conflict. So whether Israel realized afterwards that it was mistaken when it fired, but it basically killed 2 of their more experienced militiamen when they mistaken maneuvers for being fired on. So from that point on, they anticipated that Hamas will follow its ground rules and will fire back. But once they fire back, Israel has to take tougher action, and then it spirals to what we see now. The question is, will it spiral to something bigger or not? And I venture to say that as long as there's a real possibility of a long-term ceasefire being brokered by Egypt, Israel will not take it to a full-scale invasion. Because if they take it to a full-scale invasion, they still will only get a ceasefire.
Is there, though, Mike, as far as Israel is concerned, a realistic scenario for a ceasefire that does not involve a full-scale war or a larger-scale war than the one we're seeing now?
What are we talking about when we say ceasefire? Does it mean a couple months? Does it mean 6 months? Does it mean a year? And what is Hamas willing to give up in order to make that ceasefire stick? When we throw the term ceasefire out, but we don't really know what it entails, and those negotiations are still going on. If history is any judge, the Israeli government probably shouldn't put too much hope into any kind of long-term ceasefire. Hamas kind of changes its mind in terms of its maneuvers at any given moment, in terms of its desperation in any given moment, in terms of what it needs for its population to maintain its credibility at any given moment. And so we've seen what's happened to those ceasefires. They kind of get tossed in the trash at will. The issue, of course, of soldier and body exchanges, prisoner exchanges, is at the forefront as well. That's come up so many times already, and the Israeli government will be pressured to get the bodies back of dead IDF soldiers and hopefully live civilians who are being held by Hamas. No ceasefire will really be credible without that happening, and Hamas really has shown very little willingness to give up those bodies unless they get an immense amount in return, and probably more than the Israeli government is willing to give up. So that's a long answer. The short answer is no. I don't think the Israeli government really sees much of a chance of a long-term ceasefire.
May I beg to differ? Because
we like differences.
Okay, because in the last serious conflict 4 years ago, Israel did not get back Gilad Shalit. That came afterwards. And so as sensitive an issue it is with body bags, we're talking mostly about soldiers who are no longer living. Yes, there's a couple of other people there who are not soldiers. But I don't think, as sensitive that is, that that's going to be a deal breaker right now. And secondly, Hamas and Israel had a very long ceasefire for several years with occasional interruption. That was the result of that massive war that we saw several years ago. And I think that the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, is not entirely convinced that he won't be able to get that ceasefire without paying that price. But we'll see it if they're going to start mobilizing Israeli troops on the border. Then we know that Israel might be saying, well, it's time to do something more extreme.
And Mike, might that happen tonight after the cabinet meeting this afternoon? Maybe this will be the cabinet meeting where the cabinet will say, enough, we've given those ceasefire talks their chance, it's not working. Let's mobilize.
I don't see the Israeli government doing nothing. I don't see the Israeli government doing more of the same. It's just not feasible for them to turn to the populace at this point and say, you know what, we got 150 rockets coming in a day, but we're going to give talking a bit more of a chance. They'll take, I believe, some action after tonight. Will it be a full-scale invasion? No, I don't think it's going to go that far, but I think the ante has been upped in the last 24 hours in the Israeli government and the military preparing, I think, a more harsher response at this point, but nothing that will blow things up. I think they want to keep it so they still have an exit without having to go into Gaza for full-scale invasion.
You could probably say the same about Hamas, which has the ability to fire towards Ashdod, Beersheba, the largest towns in southern Israel, towards Tel Aviv, of course, Jerusalem, maybe even further north. They're not doing that.
They're not doing that right now. Again, it's this tit for tat. It's this one-upsmanship that seems to be going on right now. Keep in mind, Hamas, and Hamas only, over the last few months, has dictated the terms of a quote-unquote ceasefire. It's never been worked out between Israel and Hamas. Hamas at some point finally says, you know what, we're pulling back. I think Israel has probably had enough of Hamas dictating the terms of the game at this point, and I think the Israeli government and the Israeli military wants to dictate a little bit more how things begin and how things end.
And maybe that's what will be decided today at the cabinet meeting?
I'm not sure about that, but look, Hamas already has upped the ante a little bit this morning. We heard that there were air raid sirens in Ashkelon, which is the biggest town in the south. If there are air raid sirens in Ashkelon, maybe the missiles were intercepted, but that means something was fired towards Ashkelon. So that's already upping the ante. So the question is how the cabinet will review that, the Israeli cabinet. I think that they're still going to give these negotiations, which we don't know much about right now, a little bit more time. But it may take this mobilization on the border to convince Hamas that Israel means business.
Getting some initial indication, by the way, that the UN envoy to the Middle East, Nikolai Mladenov, has canceled, at least temporarily postponed, his meetings with Hamas in Gaza because of all the actions of the last 24 hours. So those negotiations at least put on hold for the moment.